I was special senior counsel.
Gotcha.
I came to Bell Labs in April of 1954, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Would you like another one?
No, I'm fine. Would you?
Well, wait a minute.
Okay.
Thank you. And I was there for 4 years as an attorney. During that time, I was awarded a master's degree in labor law from New York University. Was that time headquarters of Bell Labs was 463 West Street. In about 1957, Bell Labs moved its headquarters to Murray Hill, which is just 5 minutes from here. So we had a young daughter at that time, about 3 or so. And therefore, we decided to move out here, and it'd be nice driving to work every day. And Bell Labs was very prestigious at that time. And we had this house built, and we were living in Riverdale, New York. And decided to move here, both for the advantage of transportation and education, good school systems. And sort of a suburban, rural atmosphere that appealed much more than New York City. Consequently, I think our contract called for us to move into this house and finish the lease on the apartment we had at Riverdale. When I was transferred to AT&T Long Lines as General Labor Counsel on the 1st.
Oh, really?
And to remain in New York at 32 Avenue of the Americas near Canal Street, which was the headquarters of AT&T, and it played a major role in tailoring rates, particularly rates on traffic, telephone traffic in general.
Right.
But I came in as General Labor Counsel.
Gotcha.
And in that capacity, we handled the major role in contract bargaining for our 26 companies. And then they would have a bargaining session on factors relating to their particular company.
Mm-hmm.
So that was quite good. And my master's degree helped. Oh, I should back up. Bell Labs was interested in me because of certain holdings, particularly in cable,
Mm-hmm.
that had been concealed during World War II.
Oh, wow.
They wanted them back. So that was sort of a introduction to the advantages of Nuremberg.
Right, sure. How'd you get into the wild world of wiretapping? How did that...
Oh, well, there were two areas that were of primary significance. During the time I was at Long Lines Division, which the Long Lines Division was the biggest money maker.
Mm-hmm.
I was engaged a lot in the general bargaining and techniques such as the use of arbitration to handle the problems that were nationwide.
Mm-hmm.
Then I had a friend, Harry Cooper, who was the general counsel, or general attorney for Long Lines Division's southern area, centered in Atlanta, Georgia.
Mm-hmm.
Includes Southern Bell, South Central Bell, and possibly parts of related geographical areas.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
During the time I was in labor, from 57 to 65, at the Long Lines Division of AT&T, which was just down the road, you might say,
Mm-hmm.
from AT&T General Headquarters, next to St. Paul's Church on Fulton Street.
Was there...
I don't know if you're familiar with that area.
I am, yeah.
In fact, it was very convenient, as it turned out later. I was at St. Paul's, just across the street, so I could handle luncheon, ushering, and things like that.
Yeah.
Right across from the historic St. Paul's Cathedral.
Right.
And I think General Montgomery is buried there.
No kidding.
I'm not sure, one of the famous ones, I believe it is Montgomery though. But anyway, I, at AT&T Long Lines as Labor Council, handled the labor, you might say, bargaining from a legal contribution. And I also handled arbitration cases and performed them. In doing that, I think I had a record like 12-1 that of winning the cases. And one of the ideas too, not for publication,
Okay.
was to have the arbitration cases as extensively contested and therefore as expensive as a large trial. Because the union only had a certain amount of money and collateral.
Right.
And if they used it on first 6 or 7 trials, then they'd be more likely to bargain on other points rather than expend the monies.
Right.
So the general attorney in 7, I also handled as labor counsel general matters relating to our relations with law enforcement.
Mm-hmm.
Then in July of 1965, while I was at Long Lines, Harry Cooper used to take a year's leave of 1 month or so and go home to Montana to enjoy the
Really?
wilds and horseback riding and the family ranch and so forth. And he and I were quite friendly. In fact, we had wined and dined each other at Christmas in New York, the preceding Christmas.
Right.
So he called and said, in June, we're getting everything ready for you to be here for the month of July. And I frankly said, why? He said, well, you promised, I was going home. Now, I remember we had several long sessions of dining. And I guess he wined and dined me and then said how about taking my place for the month.
Mm-hmm.
So it sounded fun anyway, getting out of headquarters and getting into the field.
Right.
And I went down for the month, had a marvelous reception. Kath went home to Rochester, New York area, and I went down alone, had a new apartment, entree to the downtown luncheon club,
Mm-hmm.
given the right to use one of their nice golf clubs.
Well, be darned. Pretty swish.
It was, and I think it was called the Century Club, although I'm not sure, for lunches in town. That was really frank. And things went very well, and I learned then that Harry Cooper had decided to retire. So the general manager, Gordon Black, offered me the position of area general attorney for that region, for taking Harry Cooper's place.
Mm-hmm.
I spoke to Kath, And I was being royally entertained, by the way.
Yeah.
Southern entertainment is always to be relished. And I had a great time down there. So when Gordon Black, the general area manager for Long Lines, offered me Harry's position, after I talked to Kath, and after I'd been wined and dined by their social circle,
Yeah.
I was delighted and I accepted.
Sure.
I got back to Long Lines at the end of the month, and I walked in and mentioned to the general attorney, I think it was Hap North at the time, of what I had done, subject to the approval of himself and also the Lord Master at headquarters. He's a long way around. He said, well, Horace Moulton, the Vice President General Counsel, Moulton, had asked to see me when I got back from Atlanta. So I walked in, I knew Horace, and Charlie Ryan was the second in command, Charlie Reynolds III, at headquarters, and through labor activities I had known them quite well. So I told Horace when I went in to see him that I was delighted to accept the position, subject to his approval, of course. And he said, well, I had something else in mind. And I was sort of set on going to Atlanta. The social life was very appealing.
Mm-hmm.
And Horace said, well, I won't stand in your way. Anyway, Horace said, I'd like you to take charge of all the criminal and intelligence matters that the Bell system deals with.
Ah.
And he said pretty bluntly that if I went to Atlanta, that would be the last salary increase. So, well, let me think about that. So that's how I got into the area.
Wiretapping?
Yes.
So, Bill, we've got you now. You've been hired in the criminal law part of AT&T. They convinced you financially and otherwise that that would be a good move for you. And under that jurisdiction is really the relationships you have with the Justice Department and the executive.
Yes.
And is that the time where you got to learn a little bit about Robert Jackson and his role in wiretapping?
Well, I may have known about it before when he was Attorney General,
Mm-hmm.
and Roosevelt asked him whether he had the legal right to authorize wiretapping and national security investigations. But that was a very interesting spell.
Mm-hmm.
And that was in September of 1965 that I was transferred. And I was in the office about half a day when requests came in. Horace said there's some new type of electronic fraud device. And Mountain Bell, which was one of our companies,
Mm-hmm.
and there were 26 we had, was trying to investigate the problem. And I said, electronic toll fraud, what is that? So we had a great Irish woman who handled the administrative activities. And she said, well, let me get you what we have on this, and you can read it on the plane. And she gave me a file like that. I don't think I read very much of it because I was with a very talkative chap. And but the Bell system was facing a real menacing situation. Some of what today would be whiz kids in computers was the predecessor.
Mm-hmm.
And AT&T traffic, interstate and point to point, was controlled by a technique that emitted over the traffic lines, the interstate and local long distance,
Mm-hmm.
a 2600 cycle tune, which told the equipment that the call had just ended, and therefore the equipment was receptive to taking another call. And by the 2600 cycle having created a vacancy,
Right.
indicated it could take one. So they had a device that could activate the 2600 cycle tone, in effect seize the long distance line. And the way it worked, and we had one of the devices in a Camel, I think it was Camel, cigarette pack. And I remember when testifying later on the subject before Congress, Congressional Committee, we said this was quite a serious problem because they could, to illustrate it, dial, say, to long distance in Chicago, and when the dialing started, that indicated in the company records that it was talking to information in Chicago. Then the user of the device would press it for a 2600 cycle, seizing the line, which to the system looked like the call going to information.
Right.
and there was no record of where else it would be, but the line was seized by this 2600 cycle tune. And then you could dial anywheres, and there'd be no record of it.
Wow.
And in part, it became a matter of interest to the mafia,
Right.
particularly for horse racing, because they could seize the line, a line, and send a flash that would get to the betting places before anyone else could get there by ordinary telephone call.
Right. Wow.
We had a famous case on it. So I worked particularly closely in behalf of the Bell system with Bell Laboratories, and also with the Organized Crime and Racketeering section of the Criminal Division of the Department of Justice. And we had to innovate how we could gather evidence of such activity. By wiretapping, we set up a number of wiretap sections throughout the country on our traffic lines. And we would be collecting about 1 million calls. And then the calls would be analyzed, I guess electronically, to tell which ones had been seized by a 1200 serial tune. And the real question was, how could we determine the threat to the system, which at that time would have cost at least $1 billion, which was money in those days, if it was used for electronic toll fraud purposes. And we had the first serious case working with the Organized Crime and Racketeering section in connection with a 10-horse track betting system. And we had to figure, could you use a pen register? Could you intercept conversation, which would be wiretapping? And I recognized very soon that we would have to be very careful of what we did, because we were tapping into millions of telephone calls, but only to screen them to see if there was a 2600 cycle tone. If there was, we might have a short recording of the call placed after the 2600 cycle tone seized the line, and there was no record of it. That's where justice came in.
Right.
So we established 5 or so collection points at, would you like a little more?
If I do you?
And,
No, want me to get her?
you know, she's right there.
Yep.
Would you like something else? Wine, drink?
No, thanks. I'm good.
Okay. Am I giving you too much detail?
No, this is great. You know, one of the things you hear the term wiretap. How do they wiretap? What's the mechanism?
Well, the mechanism in those days was quite different. It was before digitalization. And what they would do is take a central point near where there was suspected criminal activity,
Mm-hmm.
and they would lease a line from a listing post that would have, the line was provided by the telephone company.
Mm-hmm. That was your private line.
Yeah. And then they would physically attach the leased line to the line running from a suspected point to the listening post.
Mm-hmm.
And then they have the capabilities of recording by use of a pen register, they call them,
Mm-hmm.
the numbers dialed. And they could also listen to the conversation
And they'd record it.
and record it. So our role was to try and do all this without blowing up the company and I knew someday, for example, Bell Labs formed several task forces as a logical group to see how to cope with this, determine the extent of it,
Mm-hmm.
and the potential. And we had to do a few things that were capable of seizing the line and listening to what was being sent by the people operating the fraudulent equipment. Because once they seized the line, they could dial anywhere in the world, and there'd be no record. It'd be just a record of the call, say, to information in Chicago from, we'll say, Jamestown. And then they would seize it.
How did it work where Bell would get the authorization to permit the private line? What were the logistics? Did you have to get something from the Attorney General's office?
Well, the Attorney General, Robert Jackson, at the time he was Attorney General, I think it was about 1941, ruled that the President had the constitutional right to authorize, in the name of national security and threats from foreign sources, to what we called seize the line. That is, get a capability of listening to what was dialed and what was said after the parties were connected. This was an application that could be applied to anywheres without court order or other authorization. It was done by creating a national security letter in about 1941. The Bell system was controlled over 95% of all the long-distance lines. Was asked to cooperate. I was very concerned that this could boomerang against us, as it did. And therefore, we said we had to have some authorization. They wanted us just to do it. They meaning law enforcement and intelligence agencies. And from our standpoint, there was no benefit to be gained except possibly stopping seizure of the lines by whiz kids and the like. But we refused to do it until several cases came before the Supreme Court in 1960s, which finally held, I think it was called the Katz case, K-A-T-Z, although I'm not sure without looking it up. And they held that intercepting a telephone call placed by a customer over a public telephone, the type you had in those days where you could make public telephone coin collect calls. We in 1924, in a case called the Olmsted Act, had said that such interceptions were not violative of the Constitution. And they reversed themselves in about 1986 or so. And they said that that was their protected activity. And then they, listening to a person using a public telephone, was protected right of privacy.
Mm-hmm.
So I was asked to tell the U.S. attorneys what cooperation the Bell system would extend in the way of aiding in wiretapping. Would we accept the responsibility? And these calls were not necessarily national security calls. So in 1968, the Congress passed the Federal Wiretapping Act. And that said that a law enforcement officer could engage in interception, but it had to be under the aegis of a court order. So I was asked to talk to the 75 or so U.S. attorneys down in headquarters. And I said we'd be glad to cooperate under a court order, but we would not engage in doing the wiretapping ourselves. We would merely supply the facilities, leased lines. This disappointed many U.S. attorneys who had been a little too close to security intelligence managers of the various Bell System companies, and were used to getting, before federal wiretapping was statutorily protected.
Right.
And so that was my first taste of really getting to know the various areas attorneys. And then we went forward. For 3 years, we said they could no longer use our trucks to carry out their aid. We would no longer supply personal identification as telephone company repairmen to law enforcement and so forth.
Right.
In other words, we got out of bed.
Right.
Many of our security officers were heads of little groups of officers who all had a law enforcement background.
Were there FBI letters to your system?
Yes, so the question came up that there was really two problems. One, those that were seasoned lines for use for nefarious criminal processes, such as horse racing.
Mm-hmm.
And we had in organized crime and justice had focused on 110 horse race locations where they were using the device to get back to the various places where the bets were placed.
Mm-hmm.
But Central Telephone Company had a small but critical role, and they refused to provide any assistance whatever without a court order.
Mm-hmm.
We were asked to try and work out something when the wiretapping would be for national security purposes
Mm-hmm.
rather than criminal purposes, criminal gathering. Robert Jackson's group had blessed the activity in 1941. Later, when the Federal Wiretap Act was passed and such activity was declared illegal without a court order, we provided input and worked out with our Washington office and myself the so-called national security letter. And that was under the authorization to do this without court order if the Attorney General said he was acting in behalf of the President in defending against all enemies.
So there actually would be a letter from the Attorney General or his designee and the FBI to Bell.
Yes, we had worked on the letter with them and agreed to accept it.
And that letter would, what information would you have, or would it be just, because it wouldn't identify the risk, who the risk is, would it?
No. What they would do is ask for wiretapping assistance. Had to be very careful that this would not be used by law enforcement, not only federal but state.
Right.
And alleged it was for national security purposes.
Were you concerned? 1968 was an interesting time in our country. In many senses, we read about J. Edgar Hoover's gathering information about Martin Luther King.
Yes, and others who were supposedly... I know we had problems with Robert Kennedy.
And Robert Kennedy, yes. Was Hoover using these FBI letters that were being sent to you as the pretext that this is national security issues? You get a sense of all that?
That was a great concern. I had recognized that the publicity would be monumental and all bad. And therefore, we refused to do any wiretapping, even for national security. but we would provide facilities that they could use. And we also even offered at times to train employees of the government with the idea that we would not be asked to actually make the wiretap.
Right.
And we took the position that the letter did not disclose who this object was, whether it was Robert Kennedy or a member of the Foreign Intelligence Group. But it was able to work out very well because we accepted the letters upon the assumption that they were authorized by the President, and the authorization exercised for bona fide national security matters. And the fact that we never knew who the target was an absolute protection. When in the early 70s, the lid came off, and Robert Nixon had authorized use of wiretapping and use of the letters against political opposition, including the press. Sonny Kleinfeld wrote a book on a lot of the wiretapping in this situation.
The abuse of power. Did you feel taken advantage of by those FBI letters? Did you, at some point when kind of this is unraveling a little bit in the 70s? I mean, I realize you get protection because they didn't tell you who specifically was the target, and therefore you relied on it, actual reliance. But do you feel like you were being used?
We were very careful not to ask.
Right.
And the courts later in legal suits for wiretapping the trying to retrace. Oh. Going back to the start of this, after the 1968 Federal Wiretap Act,
Right.
we woke up to reality when the St. Louis Post-Dispatch had a whole front page saying, ballot system, the biggest wiretapper of them all. In big, bold letters. And then we told the intelligence agencies that we were not going to further cooperate in national security wiretapping, allegedly, unless we knew nothing about the source and we had Senator McClellan of Arkansas, who was a good old boy and very pro law enforcement and intelligence agencies. He went before the Congress at a critical point without anyone really being advised, and he spoke knowledgeably before an empty chamber, and they had authorization was granted by Congress to engage in wiretapping for other than national security purposes by getting a court order, which a court order would require the telephone companies to furnish cable and pair and other lend-lease information.
So really, when you fundamentally, Bill, you were involved in the interpretation of the legacy of Attorney General Jackson's advice given in the 1940s to President Roosevelt, which found its way onto your desk at the Bell System as to how best to react to those FBI letters and where the fine line...
Yeah, we redrafted with the intelligence agencies the national security letter and agreed upon common language. But one thing we were very insistent upon, that we would give no assistance, even under court order, except in the limited circumstances which did not involve our having to do any of the wiretapping.
So except for those very limited circumstances, you didn't physically do any of the wiretapping. Did you get involved with, you provided the private line then? Is that what?
Yeah, a private line, cable and pair information.
Yep.
And any related techniques necessary to secure the information. I was... The court cases in the 1970s, the first half particularly, were very split as to whether the law enforcement letter, the national security letter, was violative of existing law in the Constitution.
In retrospect, as you reviewed Attorney General Jackson's interpretation of the Constitution, was he correct?
The courts were were split, district and federal level. Circuit courts of appeal as to whether national security letters, which had been recognized in the 1968 Wiretap Act, I have some numbers of the paragraphs playing in my mind, but I'm not sure that.
Well, your letter to me back in January of 2003 is the most amazing, detailed, quoted, cited, with all the citations that you were writing up, as if you were writing a legal brief to me, Bill. It was amazing. And and you talked about the June 1968 public law and section 25113.
Yeah, that's it. 25113 said nothing in this law affects the president's right to authorize interceptions in the name of national security. So it fortified the fact that Congress was not attempting to override Mr. Jackson's holding, and it was never really at that time tested.
Who would have guessed, Bill Kaming, that your life would intersect with Robert Jackson on many occasions? First, the legacy of the Nuremberg trial and your case and the subsequent trials, and then now also through your days at Bell in the counsel's office, wiretapping, relying on Jackson, and here we are in 2013, continuing to talk about Robert Jackson and the Jackson Center. My gosh, it just keeps coming up.
Yes. And interestingly, and this may seem strange, with the Cold War, there was no mention of Nuremberg.
Yeah.
The Nuremberg trials were, I don't think, brought up at all, except when arguing a case before one of the federal courts.
Kind of an interesting thing happened the other day. Friends of ours who have family members in Berlin are very close friends with the former president of Germany, Richard von Weizsäcker.
I know him.
And he's still alive. He
President from 1980 to 1988, twice.
perfect. And in your trial against von Weizsäcker, did your paths cross with him in court?
We were quite friendly.
Oh, is that right?
In many of the Nuremberg trials, and I'm sure today too, the counsel and long cases can be very tightly opposing what they think is adverse. But generally they maintain a personal relationship. Richard von Weizsäcker, like I think I'm just trying to remember whether he had left Germany earlier, gone to the Argentine as a business representative. And then when he came back, he was recalled when war started.
We tried to get President von Weizsäcker to the Jackson Center at an event in 2005, just because he was one of the, obviously his dad was a defendant, and he was a defense counsel, and he wrote back an incredibly long letter, sort of like yours here, you know, on his views of the Nuremberg trial. Appreciated all that we were doing, appreciated what Jackson and the subsequent prosecutors did, but it was a great detail, and I will find it and send you a copy of it.
I appreciate that. He and I were quite congenial. We were about the same age. Mm-hmm. And also, Von Braun was about the same age, and he was another junior counsel for Von Weizsäcker.
Yeah.
He was the brother of Werner von Braun, a noted atomic scientist.
Oh, yeah.
But during all the years after I left Nuremberg, not once was any real interest shown in the Nuremberg Trials, and the question of wiretapping really focused on gathering intelligence information and, when relevant, other evidence.
Mm-hmm.
Henry King was a very good friend, of course, of Richard von Weizsäcker.
I did not know that. Well, you know,
We're all the same age.
in a perfect world, this may or may not ever happen, but the friend of a friend of a friend is right now communicating with President von Weizsäcker to see if they'll permit me to go to Berlin and interview him, like I've done with several people, and so far he's not said no. So it may happen.
You might use Henry King's relationship with the
I'll play that. I'll be happy to play that card. Yeah, the Henry King card, and suggest that Henry King's certainly part of what we've done at the center.
yes, and von Weizsäcker, Richard, was quite a supporter of the war crime trials.
Mm-hmm.
later on, although of course during the trial he was bitterly opposed to his father having been, in his idea, in his mind, Richard's seduced to give evidence with the understanding that it would be used against von Ribbentrop and others, but not to have his father as a defendant. And he was but me still very bitter.
Yeah.
Against people like Dr. von Kempner.
Mm-hmm. Now, von Weizsäcker, when he was convicted, he got 7 years. What was the original sentence? Do you remember?
7 years.
And then it was commuted, right?
And it was commuted as part of this general acceptance of the German demands that if they were to be to reconstitute the Wehrmacht, as a sort of a first line of defense when the Communist Party and Russia actually crossed, so to speak, the Rubicon.
When Konrad Adenauer convinced the American government and then ultimately I think it's John McCloy, to have this general commutation, how did you feel as one of the prosecutors which convicted these guys?
Not only that, in several cases, the key issue was aggressive war, crimes against peace. The other issues were not unusual. They were horrible, like the Holocaust, the breach of protection of prisoners of war, and so forth.
Right.
But strangely enough, when McCloy did his duty, and he was sent to do it as High Commissioner, and interestingly is the date our trial ended about mid-April of 1949. Subject to correction of the record, which went to December, in May 1949, I think May 5th, the German Republic, Federal Republic of the three zones other than the Russian, became Western Germany.
Right.
And they had really been very insistent that under no circumstances would they recognize the justice of the Nuremberg Trials.
Mm.
Have you read Robert McGuire's book?
No.
That's really the law of war. You might enjoy that.
Oh, I'll check that out. There we go. Now we got your phone.
For the Du Bois, Pennsylvania, whatever the name of it was. The editor, Harold Gray, was a friend of my mother's.
Mm-hmm.
But there was really no interest in Nuremberg during the Cold War. You know, it was never, to my knowledge, cited.
No.
I don't think they made much of Mr. Jackson's statements, such as the opening and closing.
No, it sort of kicked back in during the. Excuse me. I just I don't know if you told me your reaction when McCloy did his commuting. Did you react adversely to it? Did you have an emotion, or were you glad that it's over?
Well, at that time, I had joined the bell system. In 1953. All the later talk about electronic toll fraud and national security,
Right.
except for giving kudos to Mr. Justice Jackson for his sagacious legal position on wiretap.